At the beginning of the film, Uncle Charlie is shown wooing and then murdering a woman for her riches. He barely escapes the police detectives who chase him through the back alleys of an eastern city, then boards a train, having wired his sister Emma in Santa Rosa, California, that he is coming for an extended stay with the only family he has. Uncle's arrival in Santa Rosa, Uncle Charlie's niece, young Charlie, a vivacious and warm-hearted young lady, is delighted to hear that her urbane, witty, and adventurous uncle will be visiting her family. She, her father Joseph, and her young sister and brother Ann and Roger greet Uncle Charlie at the train station, and they are shocked to see him limping on a cane, being helped by porters. He claims to be ill, and the family quickly takes him home, where Emma pampers him. Charms and idiosyncrasies. Young Charlie is totally charmed by the suave Uncle Charlie, who compliments her on her wit and attractiveness, and accompanies him about the little town of Santa Rosa. Uncle Charlie stops at a bank and makes a scene while depositing $40,000, but his strange behavior is explained as an idiosyncrasy by the adoring young Charlie. Back home, Emma, who looks up to her younger brother as the family intellectual, tells her middle-class brood that the young Uncle Charlie was such a quiet boy, always reading. She also relates an anecdote about her brother, who, after being given a bicycle, accidentally hit a streetcar and nearly died. Afterwards, while he was getting well, there was no holding him. It was just as though all the rest he had was too much and he had to get into mischief to blow off steam. This nostalgic talk warms Uncle Charlie's heart, and he fondly and sadly recalls the old world. In fact, as young Charlie is to learn later, Uncle Charlie hates the world of today and all the women in it. Meanwhile, Joseph carries on a running dialogue with oddball next-door neighbor Herbie Hawkins. Both of them are obsessed with murder, a typical preoccupation in their drab small town, and are constantly proposing means of committing the perfect murder to each other, then figuring out ways to solve the crimes. Into this tranquil backwater setting the world and Uncle Charlie's awful past begin to intrude. Jack Graham, a detective, comes upon the scene and begins asking young Charlie about Uncle Charlie, arousing her suspicions. Battling the thought that her beloved uncle could be the mass killer Jack has suggested he is, she tries to get closer to Uncle Charlie, hoping to learn about his past and allay her fears. He tells her that they are family and must stick together, being himself suspicious that Jack is really a cop on his trail. Seeing an article about himself, describing the nationwide manhunt to capture the Merry Widow murderer, Uncle Charlie tears it from the daily paper. Young Charlie sees that the paper is mutilated and, after finding the clipping hidden in Uncle Charlie's room, begins to investigate on her own. Uncle Charlie quickly discerns her suspicions, for there is almost a weird telepathy between them, and in some ways they are very much alike. But while young Charlie is good, her uncle is simply evil. This evil, which Uncle Charlie has worked to conceal, begins to burst from him. At dinner one night, he suddenly explodes when the subject of rich widows is brought up, sneering, "You see these women everywhere, useless women, drinking the money, eating the money, smelling of money." The outburst brings tears to young Charlie's eyes, her preconceived image of her noble uncle evaporating. Later, after young Charlie has definitely decided that Uncle Charlie is the mass killer Jack and the police are seeking everywhere, she agonizes over what to do. She is afraid for herself and her family and clings to the love she had for Uncle Charlie while at the same time fearing him. Nevertheless, she grows cold toward him and exchanges long, knowing glances with her uncle, who decides that he must kill young Charlie to keep her silent. Before that, he takes her to a smoke-filled bar and, sitting in a booth, tries to convince her that the little lies she has caught him telling mean nothing. But in his talk Uncle Charlie does nothing more than reveal his own hideous nature, convincing young Charlie that her suspicions are correct. Telling young Charlie that she doesn't know what the world is really like, Uncle Charlie is unable to control his all-consuming hatred for that world, his eyes narrowing and his voice growing hoarse with angry passion. Unable to bear this invective, young Charlie runs home. Later, when the family is preparing to go out, Uncle Charlie inveigles young Charlie into starting the family car in the garage. Making sure that she cannot turn off the ignition and escape, he closes the garage doors, which the family has had difficulty opening lately. While young Charlie begins to succumb to carbon monoxide poisoning, the family dawdles about Joseph going back up the stairs to get his overcoat so many times. Uncle Charlie, to cover his own devilish machinations, races to the garage and saves young Charlie, his attempt to kill her a failure. After this incident, young Charlie plots with Jack to expose her uncle, but she is still having difficulty bringing herself to hurt her family. Uncle Charlie, by now behaving like a caged animal, realizes that the law is closing in on him. It's time to flee. He tells the family that he must leave to attend to business and asks them to see him off at the train station. He entices young Charlie on board the train to say a final farewell, and, between cars, as the train begins to pull out of the station and get up lethal speed, he confronts her with her own suspicions about him, more or less admitting that he is the mass killer and that, because she knows it, she must die, though he will make her death appear accidental. He grabs her and is about to throw her through the open door, waiting for another train approaching in the opposite direction to come abreast of the one on which they are riding, so that his niece will be crushed by the oncoming engine. Not yet, Charlie, Uncle Charlie says, gauging the diminishing distance from the oncoming train, just a little longer. The train suddenly lurches, just as young Charlie pushes Uncle Charlie away, and he, rather than his intended victim, goes pitching off the train directly into the path of the oncoming engine, to be killed instantly. Young Charlie winds up with Jack at her side but does not expose Uncle Charlie's horrid past, preferring for her family's sake to let the world believe that her once-cherished uncle died in an accident. He is buried after an impressive funeral, the little town of Santa Rosa unwittingly paying tribute to one of the country's worst mass killers.